Welcome to the introduction of my channel. So what are we going to be talking about? I'm so glad you asked. On this channel, we're going to be exploring the relationship between psychosis, spiritual awakening, and psychedelics, which you can think of as forming a tripod or a three-way Venn diagram. Of these three elements, we're going to be focusing the most on the link between psychosis and spiritual awakening, because while psychedelics are a key part of this equation, it seems like everyone's already talking about them, and I don't have a whole lot that's new to add there. Now, we're going to begin this series by taking a look at each of these elements separately, and we're going to do so by breaking them down into chapters. And you might be thinking, oh, there's 3 elements? I bet there'll be 3 chapters, because that would totally make sense. But nay, that's not what we're going to be doing. Well, sort of. Basically, I've decided to split psychosis across 2 chapters, one for hallucinations and one for delusions. So chapter 1 of this series will be on auditory hallucinations, aka hearing voices. Chapter 2 will be on spiritual awakening, chapter 3 on psychedelics, and chapter 4 on delusions. So how are we going to be discussing these? Great question. In discussion of these 3 elements, we're going to be looking at a wide range of sources, including academic journal articles, which admittedly can be a bit dull, but you don't actually have to worry about that because I'm the one who's going to be reading them and I'll just give you the good stuff. Not to mention the fact that the studies we're going to be looking at are totally cool. In addition to the academic articles, we'll be looking at some articles from the news media, we'll be checking out some books, some TED Talks, some case studies, as well as some history, looking at the relevant economic and socio-political forces that are going to help put all this information into context. And I'll be posting links to all the materials we use so you can check them out for yourself. Now, what you will see emerge from all of this is that there are many similarities between psychosis, spiritual awakening, and psychedelics. Like uncanny similarities. So much so that it begs the question, what can account for all of these similarities? What can account for the tremendous amount of overlap between psychosis, spiritual awakening, and psychedelics? And the answer, at least in my view, as to what links these 3 together is something that I call the psychic realm, which is basically the same as Plato's world of forms, Aldous Huxley's mind at large, and Carl Jung's collective unconscious. People tend to think of these as metaphors, but if you take nothing else away from this video, know that what I'm saying is that it's not a metaphor. It's a real place. It's not a physical place, but it's a place nonetheless, one that you navigate with your mind, with your psyche. Hence why I call it the psychic realm, because psyche comes from the Greek for mind or soul. And that's essentially what this place is. It's the universal mind or the universal soul. Ultimately, though, it doesn't matter what you call it, whether it's the psychic realm, the collective unconscious, mind at large. All of these are just approximate descriptions for a transcendent realm which will forever lay beyond our ability to fully understand. But that doesn't mean we can't try to understand it. So here's an analogy to help us out. Imagine you're scrolling through Instagram, okay? The pictures and videos that you're coming across, they're not stored on your phone, they're stored in the cloud. Rather, you just access them on your phone. What I'm proposing is that consciousness works in a similar way to Instagram, where our thoughts and memories don't actually live in our brain. They're not stored there. Rather, that's just where we access them. We stream them. We stream consciousness. We stream reality. Now, I'm well aware of how insane this sounds, but as you'll see in later chapters, there's actually some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that this may be the case. For now, just think of the psychic realm as the cloud from which we stream consciousness. It's the non-physical realm of reality from which our physical reality originates, which I know is hard to wrap one's head around. Like, what does that even mean, okay? But we'll keep chipping away at this throughout the series. Just know that what I'm saying is that there's a lot more to reality than physical reality alone. So what does any of this streaming reality stuff have to do with understanding the link between psychosis, spiritual awakening, and psychedelics? Another great question! You are on fire today. Think of it like this. We spend the vast majority of our time in normal or default waking consciousness. It's what helps us solve problems. It's how we navigate social situations. It's what enables us to function in the society in which we live. But this state of consciousness is pretty limited. It spans just a few octaves. The idea being that consciousness exists on frequencies to which we tune in, right? We stream it. Now, when a person takes psychedelics, for example, they're tuning into frequencies beyond that narrow range of normal default consciousness. They're accessing data on frequencies that aren't typically available to them. From the point of view of somebody tuned to the standard default waking consciousness, a person on psychedelics may appear psychotic. Hence why psychedelics are considered to be psychotomimetics. They don't cause psychosis, but they mimic it. This is because they're ultimately tools that can enable one to access the psychic realm. What I will argue to throughout this series is that the same thing is happening in instances of psychosis and spiritual awakening, where individuals are tuning into frequencies beyond that range of normal default consciousness, that consciousness that's primarily concerned with physical reality. By this logic, a psychotic break is not so much a break from reality as it is an expansion of reality, albeit one that can be so overwhelming as to make it difficult, if not impossible, for an individual to function in our modern Western society. Here's another way to think of it. Imagine all of the information that makes up the internet. This information typically flows through fiber optic cables, but try instead to visualize it as flowing through a river. And then imagine dunking your head into that river where you're just hit by this unfiltered barrage of all of humanity's information. That's kind of how I think of psychosis. Spiritual awakening, on the other hand, seems to be more of a guided journey through this river, but it's the same river nonetheless. As Joseph Campbell said, the psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight. Oh, what's that? You want another analogy? Okay, here we go. You know how you often hear people describe the brain as functioning like a computer? So imagine that, but then also imagine that this computer, aka our brain, is connected to the internet, to nature's internet. Think of the psychic realm as nature's internet. And although most of us, most of the time, are stuck on the homepage, psychosis, spiritual awakening, and psychedelics all signify instances in which a person has navigated away from the mind's homepage, has navigated away from that default waking consciousness. Again, I know all of this can be tough to wrap one's head around, and believe it or not, it took me a while too. Like, I used to be a hardcore atheist and Western scientific materialist. Anytime someone told me that they were spiritual, I wouldn't roll my eyes because I'm not a jerk, but that's how I felt inside. My thinking was that if any of this stuff was real, science would have told us by now. I've since changed my views, just a bit, and now see science less as a fixed set of facts that tells us what's true and what isn't, and more as an ever-evolving process, a search for the truth, a search for greater understanding, which is the view of science that I'll be advocating in this series. And when it comes to understanding our three core elements, Western society knows very little. We know very little about psychedelics because they were made illegal in 1970, which effectively put a stop to their scientific study. We know very little about spiritual awakening because the emergence of so-called New Age thought in the 60s and 70s led to a significant backlash and stigma in academia with regard to things like consciousness and spirituality. And then we know very little about psychosis and really the mind in general because in the late 70s, psychiatry began to view mental illness as a biological disease of the brain, a model which 40 plus years later is now widely considered to have been a failure. By the way, did you notice all of these happened around the same time? Anyway, we'll be talking about that more in the second half of this series, around chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, where we'll also be looking at the history of science, the philosophy of science, as well as various economic and socio-political factors. So I invite you to join me on this journey, even if, or especially if, you're skeptical of what I've said in this introduction video, because remember, I'm very sympathetic to that viewpoint. Now, I can't promise that I'll be able to convince you of all of this, because ultimately that comes down to you. There's a very strong experiential component to all of this. That doesn't mean, however, that you have to go out and immediately start meditating or taking psychedelics to understand this. I'm definitely not saying that. What I am saying is that in order to get something out of this series, you've got to at least be open to reconsidering some things, which could be anything from simple biases you may have, all the way up to some of your most deeply held beliefs. Believing something because we always have, or because we want to, or because other people do, or because it makes us feel safe just isn't going to cut it. And I'm hoping that in watching these episodes, you might start to reflect on some of these hard questions. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be releasing the first few episodes of Chapter 1 in about a week, and I hope to see you there.